Hey everyone, today we're going to be checking and setting the valve lash on this Honda EU2000i inverter generator. This is part of a multi-video series dealing with no start and hard start conditions of this generator. You can click a link in the top right, we'll take you to the video listing for this. This particular generator suffered a lot of structural damage. I'll point out those exceptions as I do the teardown to get to the valves. We'll go through all the steps needed to conduct this procedure. Let's get started. 4 Phillips screws holding the faceplate. I remove them now. Pulling the faceplate forward, I put the 4 Phillips screws back in so I don't lose them. There are 2 separate harnesses here. One's on this side, going to these parts, and there's another one with a ground here. Pressing up on this tab allows this cable tie to be pulled through. Disconnect the cable from the ignition control module. Connectors off the echo switch. Connectors off the parallel operation. The Phillips screw on the outlet is loosened. A couple of turns. The connection is pulled straight out. Connections are then pulled off the AC breaker. I've loosened the Phillips screw on the outlet for the neutral wire and pulled it out. The ground for the panel was completely stuck, so I sprayed it with some thread loosener. I'll come back to it. These 2 connections are the DC receptacle. I push the button in the middle to release both of them. Take out one and then the other. At this point, I'm able to pull that ground screw out from the bottom. And with that, the front panel is disconnected. The condition of the front panel should be checked. We see that there's some rust towards the bottom. Significantly around the screw for the ground hole should be cleaned. Put the screw in for now. We'll deal with it later. There are 2 Phillips screws on the top side of the cover. They will be removed first. This is followed by the 2 Phillips screws on the bottom front of the cover. They are removed next. Using an 8mm, we'll loosen these screws inside. There are 3 of them. This one functions as a ground post. With the 3 screws removed, we could carefully guide the wires through their respective holes as we pull this front cover off. Four Phillips screws hold on the rear of the unit. We'll remove those screws now. This rear cover should pop right off. A Phillips screw holds in the pull starter. This plastic trim snaps down and outward and removed from the unit. Same thing on the other side. 2 long bolts are found under the plastic trim. They're unscrewed now and removed from the unit. This is followed by 2 screws that are found on both sides of the handle. Mine are hex because I've replaced them after some repairs. Lifting up the gas cap shield to release the handle, everything is carefully checked and removed. The hoses, the pull start, releasing this plastic from the generator. On the other side, the gas cap rubber is also lifted, releasing this plastic. There's a lot less to get in the way of this one, so it's a lot easier to remove. And then it's just lifted sideways and outward. The 3 screws are placed right back in the inverter. These 2 Phillips screws would then be loosened. They've already cracked off this generator. I disconnect the fuel line, go into the pump, and remove all the gas from the tank. The tank is then removed from the unit. The 2 connections are then disconnected from the inverter. The harness is pulled out of the holder, and the inverter is then removed from the unit. I take a minute to check the inverter for any damage, heat, explosions, burning, bubbled up capacitors, stuff like that. The other side actually has a screw, so I'll attempt to remove it. And it is frozen in there. So I'm going to spray this screw and then I'm going to come back to it. 8mm socket takes off the 2 nuts that holds on the air filter and the carburetor, so I loosen those. Disconnect the crank vent and pull off the whole air filter assembly. Engine vacuum is disconnected from the fuel pump. Fuel pump out is disconnected from the carb. Finally, the ignition switch is disconnected, which allows this bracket to be removed. The gasket is removed, followed by the carburetor, followed by the inner gasket. This screw that had been soaking is now able to be loosened, and with that, this bracket is able to be lifted off. I put the screw back in so I don't lose it. I do the same thing on the other side, even though the bracket's broken, because I'm going to repair the bracket and I need the screw working. I use a large screwdriver to slide these mounting lugs through the bottom plate and push them out. There's the front one. I do the same thing in the back. Now the engine can be lifted off the bottom plate and set to the side. Opening this rubber cap exposes the third 10mm bolt that will be removed to remove the pull start assembly. I take the assembly off and put it to the side. The 3 screws are then reinstalled into the unit. The rectifier cable is disconnected, as well as the connection to the ignition coil. 8mm will also remove these 2 grounds found on the lower left side of the engine. Just as before, the screws are put right back in. The coil cable is disconnected from the spark plug, and these 3 8mm bolts are then removed to remove the fan housing. The fan housing is pulled off and stored in a safe place. 2 bolts are removed on the exhaust side of this inner cover. And both back bolts are loosened. The exhaust side cover will then slide right off of the unit. The 2 bolts are then immediately put right back in. The same 2 bolts are then loosened and removed on the other side. I stop for a minute to pull the breather hose out. And then the 2 bolts that hold on the carb spacer will now be removed. There's a stuck gasket behind here. It's holding everything together. It's going to tear. This is all going to be replaced. It's fine. It tore and the spacer popped off, freeing everything up. So the spacer is now out. And with that, this cover will come right off. I just need to clear that one vacuum line. Comes off rather easy. And this cover's off. Put the spacer bolts right back in so I don't lose them. And I put the breather hose back in so I don't lose that or get any crap in the breather. Now we're ready to open up the valve cover and work on the valves. Before I forget, I got these 2 screws I got to put back in so I don't lose these either. As well as these screws. These were for the fan shroud. I'm putting these back in. Now I can continue. I'm going to remove the spark plug for this operation. Make it a lot easier to rotate the engine. And using a 10mm, I'll open up the 4 bolts on the valve cover. I'll just say right now, if the engine ran today, don't continue this procedure until tomorrow. There's a provision right here to insert a flathead screwdriver and twist it to break the seal in the valve cover without damaging it. Now the seal is broken, I can lift the cover right off. It's sealed together with HONDABOND. As I rotate the engine, you see the valves open and closed, the intake open and closed, the exhaust open and closed, intake open and closed, and now they're both closed. That's where we want to be. The manual references a mark right here that lines up against a starter that may be on or off by 360 degrees. I didn't feel as though I needed that. I'm able to tell if both valves are closed. And when they're both closed, I could jiggle the tappets like this. You could hear them. Jiggle the other one. This one's louder. This one has definitely more gap. Intake is supposed to be 0.15 millimeters. We're going to check the intake first. It's supposed to be tight slide. So I can slide this in. This is definitely 15. Kick it up to the next size. This is 17. I try and slide it in, and 17 does not clear. So 15 is good. We're going to say the intake is good. We're going to leave it alone. Make our way to the exhaust, and we already felt this has a wide gap, but this is supposed to be 20. So we're going to try this with 20 and slide this in, and 20 falls right in, no problems at all. We're going to kick it up a notch. Next one is 0.229, almost 0.23. And this one clears with a tight fit. So the exhaust is out of spec, so we will be doing an adjustment if on the exhaust only. I'm going to take it up to 0.254 to see if that passes in the exhaust, to see exactly how bad it is. And that one passes. The exhaust really is out of spec. You could go online and buy Honda's official tappet wrench for about $60, or you could buy a better one for about $10. Any super thin profile 3mm wrench will do for this job though. You will also need a thin profile 9mm wrench. Seat that 9mm down on the locking nut first. The 3mm will hold the adjustment nut in place, and now I will break tension on the locking nut so the adjustment nut can be turned. Stick the .20 feeler gauge in there to get a reference for where I'm at, and with the feeler gauge in there, I'll turn the adjusting nut till it clamps down on there. I'm going to remove the gauge and put it back in because I want to see how it slides. I want it to slide tightly on the adjuster there. Relocate off to the left here so we could sit here out of the way while I bring the wrench back down and hold the adjustment into position as I tighten down the locking nut. Not really tight, just enough so I could recheck the adjustment while it's snugged into some sort of locked position, and we'll test it out. If it's not right, I could always loosen it and try again. There's a nice pull on it, but not as much as I wanted, so I opened it up, made it a bit tighter, and retested it. Now I'm going to tighten it down to its final position because the adjustment is good. Not too tight, you don't want to break it. And now I'll pull it out and we'll test it one more time, and it is a tight fit at 0.2. The valve cover was gasketed from the factory with HONDABOND. You cannot use any solvent to remove HONDABOND, so we're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way. I'm going to start with a razor blade to remove any of the excess material, being very careful not to gouge the aluminum and always to cut this material off pushing outward so it doesn't fall into the engine but out onto the bench. Now I'm using a hard nylon brush, always brushing away from the inside of the engine. It's not a quick process. Any of the larger areas I'm scraping with my fingernail and then using the brush. It's not quick, but it does work and everything comes off. Finally, I go over the surface with some carb cleaner and a paper towel. The same exact process is repeated for the cover, but you don't have to worry about anything falling into the engine. With that in mind, you could also use a cotton towel with carb cleaner on it and rub it to get the HONDABOND off. You can see you can't do this on the engine because it throws flakes everywhere. This part is washed out, dried out, ready to go. Both mating surfaces are cleaned with a towel and carb cleaner one last time. Then we're going to seal it with an application of HONDABOND 4. I'm going to get the spark plug out of the way. Have my 4 bolts at the ready and a 10mm socket. HONDABOND is not very viscous, so it's hard to apply a bead. So I'm going to put a thin and even coat all the way around the perimeter, and then I'm going to level this very thin coat with my finger in order to evenly distribute it. Any excess I'm putting onto a towel. It's off to the side of the camera. I'm trying to work quickly because I only have a couple of minutes to do this. Taking a feeler gauge to remove any that may have dripped towards the inside and the outside. Now I'm going to immediately lay the cover down. I have 2 bolts at the ready to align the cover. Once I get those in, I start turning everything in. I want to make sure that all the slack is removed from the bolts before I start torquing anything down. At that point, all 4 bolts will be snugged. Remove the bolts from the intake now. I got this half-torn gasket that I'm going to remove from here. See how much I could get off easily. Then I'll fill the port with paper towel. Soak this gasket remnant in PB Blaster, let it soak. Then very carefully, I'll remove the remnants of this gasket with a brand new, very sharp razor blade, being sure not to gouge any of the metal. Finish everything off with a towel and brake cleaner. The other half of the gasket was on the insulator. Use the same procedure to remove the gasket from this, being extremely careful as this is plastic and the razor blade could easily mar it. Now these 2 bolts for the cover will be removed, as well as the breather hose. The vacuum hose goes through the smaller hole. and the cover is placed onto the engine, moving the cable harness out of the way. The rear portion snaps in, and then the 2 bolts that hold the cover are installed into the unit. The slack from both bolts are then removed, and both bolts are then snugged down. The breather hose is then reinserted into the port so contaminants don't get in. On the exhaust side, the 2 bolts that hold the cover are removed. The cover is then laid into position. The rear portion is snapped into place. The 2 screws for the cover are then inserted and screwed in. The slack is removed, and then the screws are snugged down. Finally, both screws on the rear, the slack is removed, and then those screws are also snugged down. We have a new insulated gasket. It goes right here. If I have to take it apart for any reason, I don't want it to tear, so I'm going to put a very thin coating of anti-seize on both sides. I'm just going to kind of paint it silver is what I'm going to do. This should stop the gasket from sticking to the metal and plastic surfaces. I'll preload it onto the insulator with the 2 bolts to hold it in position, then drop it through the plastic cover into place. Turning the screws once it's in the right position will secure everything. I'll draw out the slack of both sides with an 8mm, and then gently lock both sides down. Finally, clean up all the remnants of anti-seize that gets everywhere. And that looks good. Could also be looked at from the side to make sure everything's seated properly, and that appears to be good. Now the 3 bolts for the fan shroud will be removed. There's a detent here for the rubber grommet for the cable harness. There's the grommet right here that'll go in first. So slide that all the way in till it stops. The fan shroud will then be lowered into position, and the 3 bolts will then be inserted, turned a couple times to align everything. The screws will all be tightened progressively so that the seal gets compressed evenly. And then all 3 of the screws will be tightened down. The engine is now lowered onto the tray, aligning the mounts. The front pin is slid through first, securing that portion of the engine. This is followed by the rear pin. Shaking the engine during install makes it go in easier. The screws for the 2 grounds on the fan shroud are now removed, and these grounds are reinstalled. The cable's reconnected to the rectifier, as well as the barrel connected to the ignition coil. These 3 screws are now removed that hold on the pull starter. The pull start handle points to the left. It is laid into position, aligning the 3 screw holes. The screws are then installed to hold it into position. The slack is removed, and all 3 bolts are then gently tightened down. A quick test shows the mechanical function to be working properly. I'm using new spark plugs, so I'm making sure it's measuring 0.7 gap. Installing that into the engine now, screwing it by hand to full seat, and now I'm going to torque it down. Since it's new, there's a washer that compresses, so it's kind of an eerie feeling. You think it's stripping out, but it's actually just a compression. And I pop the cap back on. The cob will be installed this time, first with the inner gasket, followed by the cob, which slides right on. And then the outer gasket. You'll note these gaskets are all new. Now to the gas tank. There's a rubber holder right here and a detent on the gas tank that sits in it. So we're going to push the gas tank into that rubber holder to seat it. It's only seating on one side for now, but it will hold the gas tank in place. Now the fuel line will be connected from the gas tank to the on-off switch. The metal spring clip will secure the hose. Vacuum line from the engine will then plug into the fuel pump. The output from the fuel pump will plug into the carburetor, and the clip will be secured over the carburetor to hold everything together. I'll remove this screw, which has been stored in the frame, and then I'll carefully negotiate the pull starter handle through first. It's got to come through sideways to get it through. Kind of fidgety. And then the bracket comes through. The screw hole of the bracket will face down. This clip goes upwards. Everything kind of fall into place. And then we'll get the screw screwed in on the bottom. The detent on this side of the gas tank goes into this rubber holder, just pressed right in. These two circular brackets up top connect together, just like that. Square fitting right here locks in. You'll note extensive repairs on this one, but the concept is the same. There are two screws that go through to lock this into place. Turn this damaged screw into a flathead. And that bracket is in. Finally, the ignition switch cable is connected. I've got brand new primary and secondary filters from the maintenance kit. I've replaced the housing seal too. Filters are generally cleaned and then soaked in motor oil, evenly distributed, and then wrung out. The new filters are installed in the airbox. The airbox is then closed up and tightened down. It'll then be installed onto the carburetor, secured with the two nuts, and then snugged down. The crank ventilation is then reconnected to the filter box, in this case repaired, and then reconnected to the filter box. Starting the assembly of the case, the spark plug side cover is placed back on, lifting up that rubber cover for the gas tank. We get that little piece back in position. The other side of the cover, a little more complicated. Got to pull out some of that pull start and pull it through this hole right here. Still have to line up everything as well as that rubber piece for the gas tank. Get that back in position. Push this bracket through, make sure it's fully seated. These are supposed to be Phillips, but again, I've changed them post repair. So I've got hex, so I'm going to screw in these top screws first, make sure all the plastics line up as I do that. Followed by these long bolts on the bottom, which go all the way through the plastics, all the way through the mounts, out through to the other side. I'm going to tighten this in now as I hold the plastics together and align them. Here's that second bolt that goes all the way through the case out the other side. I am supporting the other side with my hand and aligning it as I tighten this down. Then I snap on the cover for the spark plug and install this screw for the pull starter. This holds it to that inside bracket. I'm going to feed both cable bundles through their corresponding holes. This is the one on this left-hand side, and then there's one on the bottom, goes in through the right-hand side like this as I bring this front cover closer towards the end. Before it's fully situated, I'm going to snap in these moldings. This is the first one. Snap it all the way up to the top, and then the second one, I'm going to snap this one up as well. The upper side screws will be installed in the front cover. I use anti-seize on all of these screws that go into metal so they don't get stuck the next time. But no anti-seize on these three bolts, which I'm now installing the third bolt, which is actually the ground lug for this harness. These two bottom screws will go in. These get anti-seize. And I've started to put on the connections to the back cover based on all the connections I've recorded when I removed it. These are going through the breaker right here. And this is for connecting another generator. This is for the echo mode. I'm reconnecting that now. This is for the ignition control unit. Clean the ground area back to a shine. I'm going to put that screw back in now. Tighten it down by hand first. Hanging the generator off the end of the bench, I was able to tighten that screw from under. Then we have these two DC cables that lock into place. The white one goes to the positive annotation, and the black one goes to the negative annotation towards the outside. This cable tie provides stress relief. It goes around these two cables in this bundle and is locked in position and tightened down. The cover is pushed back and closed in position with the screw set in by hand, and then tightened down with a screwdriver just snugged. That's it. The rear cover presses right on. There are 4 Phillips screws treated with anti-seize that hold in the rear cover. Finally, the service panel is reinstalled, and we just secure it down with a flathead screwdriver. It's fully assembled. We'll test it for correct operation, fill it up with some fresh gasoline, turn on the choke, turn on the ignition. Admittedly, I gave it several pulls to prime the carburetor bowl. Drop the choke, the engine sounds good. There's something rattling inside the workbench. All the indications here look good. No oil alert. Switch it off, echo throttle. That's working good. Switch echo throttle back on, and it drops down correctly. Kilowatt set to watt. I plug in my 2-stage 1500 watt heat gun. We'll do some tests. First at 750 watts in echo mode. I switch it up and it ramps up, and we're seeing about 760, which is about right for this heat gun. We drop it to the full tilt, and we're seeing about 1470, 1480. This is looking good, so I'll shut it off. Heavy sustained loads like this normally wouldn't be in echo mode, so I'm going to shut off echo mode, and we're going to try it again and see how it looks in the normal throttle. Repeat. We can see how quick it ramped up now. Look at that, 784, very nice. And now full tilt, jumped right up, 1490, 1485, looking very good. The generator's working just fine. And that concludes the valve adjustment on this EU2000i inverted generator. I hope you found this video enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Hit that like button down below, it helps me out a lot when you do, and hit that subscribe button to get notified about more videos like this when they come out. When another video in this series comes out, a link will be posted in the top right. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?